Prologue to Green Tea introduces two individuals. The first is a narrator who is unknown, and the second is Martin Hesselius, a German doctor, of whom the narrator has worked for as a medical secretary. The narrator states that he's found a series of letters written by Dr. Hesselius to a friend, Professor Van Loo of Leiden, and he tells us that the contents of the letters may either amuse or horrify the general reader. Chapter 1 begins the narrative of Dr. Hesselius himself, who tells us that he has met a reverend named Mr. Jennings. The Reverend Mr. Jennings appears normal enough, and yet it seems that he has an odd reputation. He is known for falling into prayer in the middle of giving a sermon, and in addition, he's been seen looking as though he's hallucinating. At the party where they've met, Dr. Hesselius is surprised to find that the Reverend Mr. Jennings has read some of his papers. It's the doctor's treatise on metaphysical medicine. Here the doctor notes that as they discuss the topic, Mr. Jennings is behaving in a very strange way. Chapter 2 brings us into a conversation between Dr. Hesselius and Lady Mary Hayduke. It was at her place where the doctor had met the Reverend, and now the doctor is curious to know a little more about him. For reasons unknown, she says that her and the Reverend used to quarrel about green tea. As their conversation progresses, the doctor takes interest in learning more about a story that the Reverend's father used to tell, in which he claims that he has seen and even spoken to a ghost. In Chapter 3, Dr. Hesselius pays a visit to the Reverend Mr. Jennings at his home. Because the Reverend is momentarily busy, he's asked to wait in the Reverend's study. Here the doctor takes the liberty of perusing some of the Reverend's books, where he finds some interesting material concerning the subject of evil spirits. The prologue to Green Tea has that essence of verisimilitude. This narrator is talking about how he had met a man and that he worked for him and that he had found papers among his library that he read and was interested in, and now he's presenting it for an audience. It is that verisimilitude that is key to a lot of Victorian writing, because Darwin really turned the world upside down with his theory of evolution. And even though we had a lot of science leading up to Darwin, there's no question about that, his was really impactful in that it really challenged the church belief of creation, of where people come from. Of course, Sheridan Le Fanu wrote about fantastical things, supernatural things, and so this technique of using verisimilitude by saying, I found these papers, and of course what he does is he's presenting a series of letters that were written, so that's the epistolary form, which means there's verisimilitude in the idea that something was written by one person to another about what they discovered. It's really a creative writer's technique to explain or just sort of venture into the world of the supernatural by having a grounded sort of scientific approach, like this way of persuading people that what's being read is something that actually occurred or it could occur. It's just the way it was for the Victorian era. I have my own anxieties about reading translated works, and I may have mentioned that in some of my previous videos, or at least one of them. I have this innate desire to read something in its original language because I want to understand what I'm reading as best as possible. I don't want any other hands in it, so to speak. There's a very interesting line in this story that highlights my anxiety about reading works that have been interpreted and transposed and transcribed, all these different words you can use for moving a story from one language into another. Here's the passage, and I will read it to you. These letters, from a memorandum attached, appear to have been returned on the death of the professor in 1819 to Dr. Hesselius. They are written in English, some in French, but the greater part in German. I am a faithful, though I am conscious, by no means a graceful translator, and although here and there I omit some passages and shorten others and disguise names, I have interpolated nothing. The idea that an interpreter could omit things and change things and do different things in the process of translating something for other readers affects how we understand a text. When you're studying English, you learn about different types of writing, and there's a distinction to be made between what's known as paratactic writing and hypotactic writing. Paratactic is classically linked to Hemingway, where there are 4 or 5 words per sentence. I went down by the water. I went up the side of the cliff. And so what happens with hypotactic writing is you create a clause, then under it you have another clause, then under it you have another clause, and it goes on and on and on. And some of these sentences can get really long. And what I'd like to read for you is an example of this long sentence, which is known as a hypotactic sentence. A medical philosopher, as you are good enough to call me, elaborating theories by the aid of cases sought out by himself and by him watched and scrutinized with more time at command, and consequently infinitely more minuteness than the ordinary practitioner can afford, falls insensibly into habits of observation which accompany him everywhere and are exercised, as some people would say, impertinently upon every subject that presents itself with the least likelihood of rewarding inquiry. The writing here with regard to the supernatural is really interesting because it blends a technical way of writing with ideas that are obviously going to challenge someone's belief, or they're going to reinforce them if they're superstitious, if they can understand it. In this passage, what it is that there's a really intense scrutiny on this notion of believing in the supernatural. Dr. Hesselius is using his scientific mind to describe the soul or the spirit, something that is very difficult, obviously, to describe. I may remark that when I hear speak of medical science, I do so as I hope someday to see it more generally understood in a much more comprehensive sense than its generally material treatment would warrant. I believe the entire natural world is but the ultimate expression of that spiritual world from which and in which alone it has its life. I believe that the essential man is a spirit, that the spirit is an organized substance, but as different in point of material from what we ordinarily understand by matter, as light or electricity is. That the material body is, in the most literal sense, a vesture, and death consequently no interruption of the living man's existence, but simply his extrication from the natural body, a process which commences at the moment of what we term death, and the completion of which, at furthest a few days later, is the resurrection in power. When Dr. Huselius uses his scientific skills to explain the nature of the spirit, it speaks to the dilemma that has faced humankind since the inception of conscious thought, that we are innately desirous to validate the supernatural aspects of our beliefs. In this manner, we have the perpetual doubting Thomas, contending with the words of Jesus himself, who once said, "Blessed are those who believe without seeing." In spite of the Savior's distinctive words, we have our paranormal investigators with their EVP devices and our equipment at the ICU beds that presume to capture near-death experiences. We have our teams of archaeologists scouring the Middle East for evidence of biblical occurrences. And we have our scientists attempting to measure psychic phenomenon. And yet the frustration remains, because inwardly we know that proofs in these areas cannot be replicated or proven beyond a reasonable doubt. For an in-depth look at how these arguments are played out, The Exorcism of Emily Rose portrays with great insight how this dilemma could be argued, and even, potentially, the effects that it can have on society. One of the more perplexing attributes of the film concerns the beliefs of the attorney, Ethan Thomas, who is arguing against the supernatural, because he himself is apparently a man of God. Ultimately, it may indeed boil down to what Robert Langdon told Sophie at the end of The Da Vinci Code, where he quips with a hairline tone of cynicism, "The only thing that matters is what you believe."